So, Todd, it has been 1 year since the U.S. pull out from Afghanistan, and there have been a lot of headlines out there. But with so much going on in the world, in our country, it's an issue that is, for some people, really fallen off the radar. What can you tell us about the current state of Afghanistan 1 year later?
Well, there's a lot of hardship in Afghanistan. The economy is in shambles. I'll never forget interviewing John Weaver, the author who lived in Afghanistan for a number of years right after the takeover for our Voice of the Martyrs radio podcast. And one of the things he said, I'll never forget, he said, that the Taliban are fighters, they're not governors. And now, for the last year, they've had to be the governors. They've had to be the people who kept the trash getting picked up. They kept the electricity on, and it's really not in their skill set. They're fighters. They're not governors, and so the whole country is suffering because of that. And our Christian brothers and sisters are certainly a part of that.
I've seen reports of people selling their kidneys to feed their children. The dire poverty on the whole that is going on there is really, quite horrific. You mentioned Christians, and it's interesting because in America, the freedoms we enjoy, we might have certain assumptions, like when the Taliban came in, maybe all the Christians left. Maybe there aren't Christians there still, but that's not quite the reality. What can you tell us about Christianity as it currently stands on the ground there in Afghanistan?
Well, I'm happy to report that there are Christians still in Afghanistan. There are Christians in every province of Afghanistan. And certainly many Christians did flee a year ago with the Taliban takeover, especially those who were publicly known, those who maybe had worked with Western aid organizations or had somehow been kind of publicly identified as a follower of Christ. Most of those kind of Christians left because they knew the Taliban theology. They knew what would happen to them under the Taliban rule. The people, though, the Afghan people, that those people led to Christ, what I might call, second or third generation Afghan Christians who were less well known, many of them made the incredibly bold decision to stay in Afghanistan. They knew also what the Taliban's theology was. They knew also what would happen if they were outed as Christians. But their attitude was, listen, if all the Christians leave the country, who's still going to be here to share the gospel? And so they made that decision to stay. Now, their lives have certainly not been easy for the last 12 months. In fact, one of the Christians that Voice of the Martyrs is acquainted with in Afghanistan, just in the first 8 months after the Taliban takeover, he and his family had to move 3 times because once your neighbors start asking questions about, hey, who was that person who visited your home? Or why didn't we see you at the mosque for Friday prayers? Once they start asking those questions, you face that decision point of, okay, do I stay here and try to explain myself, or do I move to someplace else where they don't know me? They don't know that I'm a follower of Christ. And like I say, for his family, 3 times in 8 months, they made the decision to move to try to protect themselves. So it is a difficult place to follow Christ. But as I said, there are followers of Christ in every part of the country.
And I mean, just to put it into perspective for those who don't know, you're talking about a scenario where 99.8% of the country, according to Voice of the Martyrs, your organization statistics, are Muslims. So this is not only are you in a minority group as a Christian, it's a very, very small group of believers, and it's a hostile environment. When the Taliban came back and reemerged, they promised they were going to treat women's rights differently than they had before, that they were going to treat others in the country better. Have any of those promises come to fruition?
There were a lot of promises, weren't there? I remember being told about Taliban 2.0. This is the kinder, gentler Taliban. No, those promises have not been kept. And I'm glad you pointed out the hostile environment that Christians in Afghanistan live in, because one of the things that's important for people to know is there's always been persecution of Christians in Afghanistan. It's not just the Taliban that will persecute you for following Christ. It might be your father. It might be your older brother who says, listen, we are a Muslim family. By following Jesus, you have brought shame on our family. The only way we can get rid of that shame is either to get you to come back to Islam or to punish you severely. So even before a year ago, before the Taliban takeover, there has always been persecution in Afghanistan. But certainly now you have the weight of the Taliban, you have the weight of the national government brought to bear against Christians, as well as those family and tribal persecution that we've always seen.
Yeah, I don't know how much you want to get into this, but obviously, this is something that the pullout of Afghanistan is something that has frustrated a lot of people. You've seen a lot of comments from former President Donald Trump talking about how horrific this was. And you had a situation that wasn't perfect with the U.S. there, but that seemed quite different a year later when you juxtapose life a year and a half ago, let's say, to life in Afghanistan now. How do you think history is going to look back on that U.S. pullout and the effect that was had afterward?
I'm not a politician, and I don't get paid by the government. I don't get paid to talk about the government. The thing that I recall though is the peace agreement was worked out by the Trump administration, and then the Biden administration handled the pullout. So I think as you look at what happened in Afghanistan, there are lots of questions for people on both sides of the aisle to answer about how that happened and what decisions were made. Sitting down with the Taliban, and again, there were a lot of promises made by the Taliban, but those promises have not been kept, and there hasn't been really mechanisms to make sure that those promises were kept.
What has been for you the most heartbreaking story, perhaps, that you have heard to come out of Afghanistan, especially in the past year since all of this has unfolded?
When I think about Afghan Christians who, like I say, everyone in Afghanistan is suffering. So, the economy's in shambles. There's not enough food. There's not enough housing. There's not enough fuel for heat. Everyone is suffering. But then to have added on top of that the suffering for the gospel, the suffering for Jesus' sake, I think that does sort of grab a hold of my heart and make me think again of the boldness of those Christians who decided to stay. They had their eyes open. They knew what was coming. They knew the potential for more suffering, even the potential for their deaths. And yet they said, we're going to stay here. Someone needs to represent Christ in this country, and we're willing to make the sacrifice to do that. I'm incredibly inspired by the courage of those brothers and sisters who made that decision.
How can people support your organization, the Voice of the Martyrs, and in turn support Afghanistan?
Well, our website is persecution.com. You can connect with us there. You can actually donate online if you want. You can donate specifically to help Afghan Christians. Voice of the Martyrs is helping Afghan Christians inside Afghanistan. We're also helping some of those who were displaced and are now in the surrounding nations. They're still in a Muslim context. They still face the possibility of persecution, but they are continuing to be a witness for Christ in those areas. So I'd encourage people to connect with us at persecution.com.
Todd, thank you so much, as always, for coming on and joining us to tell us about this important issue. We look forward to having you back very soon.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to talk to you.